What a fantastic turnout tonight. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Frank Harvey. I am the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at Dalhousie University. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize that the Student Union building, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Dalhousie University, and our community benefit from and sit on Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, treaties the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and surrender of resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to become an ongoing relationship between nations. We are very grateful for our partnerships, for our friendships across Dalhousie. We are grateful for our community leaders, our elders and residents, our Indigenous Advisory Council, our faculty's Indigenous Studies program, and we remain very committed to building on those critically important relationships and friendships. We are all treaty people, and we take those words very seriously. It is my pleasure to introduce one of the elders here at Dalhousie, a member of the Elders in Residence program, Elder Deb Eisen, to deliver a special welcome and a prayer.
Good evening, everyone. If I could ask everyone to stand, please, if you can. Ane bojo nanitemakus and dejanakos no meyangunaway anishnabe kwe bachuana. Creator, we thank you for the beautiful sunshine and the fresh air that you have given us today to help cleanse our lungs of any intoxins. And Creator, we ask the spirits of our ancestors and you to come into this room tonight and help us to open our ears and our minds to the words that we are about to hear. I pray, Creator, for the students that go to this school and to help them and guide them through their studies. And for those men and women who are sick and need your help and strength and guidance in the days ahead, Creator, I ask that you be with them and give them strength on their road to health. And for our family members, those men and women who are preparing themselves for their final journey to you, or who have begun their final journey to you, I pray, Creator, that you guide them and be with them and give them bravery so they will not be afraid. And Creator, for those men and women who work tirelessly day in and day out, protecting our way of life here in Jabuktuk, I pray that you keep them safe until their duties are complete and they return back to their family and their friends. And lastly, Creator, for those men and women, those veterans who are far from home, protecting our way of life here on Turtle Island, I pray that you keep them safe until their duties are complete and they return back to Turtle Island and back to the loving arms of their family and their friends. Kahomigwich aha. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elder Deb, and thank you as well for your service to the country, 36 years of service to the Canadian military. Thank you. One final note before we begin, if you can please refrain from taking any pictures during the presentation. There may be an opportunity for pictures in the question and answer period. We are taping the entire lecture, and we have an excellent photographer in Dan who's taking pictures all evening. So if I could ask you to hold off on pictures during the presentation. The Shaar Shalom Lecture at Dalhousie University is a public lecture that explores the broad themes of tolerance, multiculturalism, diversity, difference, and inclusion in Canada, the US, and globally. The lecture is intended to highlight the shared interests of the Shaar Shalom Synagogue, Dalhousie University, and the Faculty of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences in advancing scholarly understanding and public discussion and dialogue around these core themes, principles, and values. And I'm sure you'll all agree that engaging in meaningful dialogue related to these core principles and values is an important mission that is particularly pressing at a time when the democratic institutions and leaders that we typically rely on to defend and celebrate and promote those principles are failing. When these pivotal leaders choose instead to openly celebrate and intentionally exploit nationalism, isolationism, intolerance, division, exclusion, racial tensions, and fear. That is why this lecture series is so important. That is why faculties like ours that deliver programs to students and the community in the areas of humanities, social sciences, and arts, why these programs are so fundamental and so vital to the university and to Dalhousie University, any university. We are so grateful to the anonymous donor, the Shaar Shalom Synagogue, and the Shaar Shalom community for their very generous support for this lecture series. I am so delighted to introduce our guest speaker for the 2019 Shaar Shalom Lecture. Stephen Lewis is an outspoken and respected humanitarian who has worked to improve the human condition both at home and abroad. He started his career as a member of the Ontario Legislative Assembly, where he served from 1963 to 1978, during which time he became leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party and leader of the official opposition. His work with the United Nations spanned more than 2 decades. From 1984 to 1988, he was Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. From 1995 to 1999, Mr. Lewis was Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF at the organization's global headquarters in New York, and from 2001 until the end of 2006, he was the UN Secretary General Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS in Africa. Mr. Lewis has just completed his term as Professor of Distinction at Ryerson University in Toronto. He is co-founder and co-director of the international advocacy organization AIDS Free World, and he serves as the board chair of the Stephen Lewis Foundation. Between 2003 and 2017, the Stephen Lewis Foundation dispersed and committed a total of $106 million to program spending, including direct support for over 1,600 initiatives with 315 community-based organizations in 15 African countries. Mr. Lewis is a companion of the Order of Canada, Canada's highest honor for lifetime achievement, the author of a best-selling book, Race Against Time, and he holds 42 honorary doctorates from Canadian and American universities. I could have said 10, and that would have been impressive. So on behalf of Dalhousie University, the Shaar Shalom Synagogue, and the students, faculty members, and staff of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, it is a distinct honor and privilege to thank you for your many important contributions that truly capture the essence of the foundational principles and values, goals, and aspirations underpinning this public lecture series. Welcome to Dalhousie. The topic tonight is, can the United Nations be saved?
Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. That was an extraordinarily amiable and gracious introduction, which did make me feel as though my entire life was in the past tense. And I obviously noticed the titter of incredulity that swept through the audience at the reference to honorary degrees. And it requires, as many of you will know, an immediate confessional from me. I attended 4 post-secondary institutions of celebrated higher learning in Canada over an infinite number of years and managed never but ever to acquire a degree. I therefore spent my entire adult life shamelessly lusting after honorary degrees. I actually have a strategy. I don't want you to think that these were conferred upon me with some legitimacy. Whenever I speak to a university audience in Canada, or for that matter in the United States, and there is some auspicious person present, I simply say, as I would in the case of the dean, and there are the president here from St. Mary's and others, I would simply say it would grieve me to leave this university confine after I have disgorged remarks insightful and profound without an honorary degree. Therefore, would you be kind enough to bring it before your Senate or notable authorities, and 3 or 4 weeks later, there arrives in the mail an invitation. So please don't think it legitimate. And I'm obviously now in my geriatric phase, and I'm more and more fascinated by what is going on in this fetid world, and deeply appreciate the opportunity to provide the Shaar Shalom Lecture tonight in conjunction with Dalhousie University. I'm a trifle discombobulated because I made the mistake of watching the State of the Union address last night, an address which was a Byzantine shambles of incoherent rambling. I know that the American consul is here, and I apologize for any indiscretions I may venture upon, but I think the president is a fool. I am... In the context of this lecture, I suppose it is necessary for me to say that one of the things which has put the United Nations at risk, and indeed imperils the entire apparatus of multilateralism, is the gradual United States disengagement. It's not only withdrawing from the Human Rights Council in Geneva specifically, and from UNESCO on a variety of grounds, but it's also the diminution in funding that is normally provided for tremendous human imperatives all around the world, and it's a very painful reality. And I want to talk a little bit about whether or not the United Nations can survive the constant arrows of outraged fortune which head its way. And in this audience, which I suspect is a pretty knowledgeable audience, let me make this point, that there are really two United Nations. One of them is constituted with the Secretary General and the Security Council and the General Assembly, and that is the political wing of the United Nations, and that's where much of the disaffection and much of the public concern stems from. It's obvious that we grind down in a kind of abattoir of inflexibility when dealing with tremendous human concerns. I remind you that the Security Council in particular was unable to deal with the atrocities that were occurring in Rwanda, that General Romeo Dallaire, who has a base right here doing his child soldier initiative in Dalhousie. By the way, I want to commend Dalhousie for that. It's quite amazing what General Dallaire has achieved with his child soldier initiative. He is, as everybody knows, one of the world's most decent and generous and lovely human beings. I can't get over. I don't know how they make Romeo Dallaires these days. I regard him as a good friend, and I know something of what he has achieved internationally in wrestling child soldiers out of the arms of the predators. And so it's important to think back to Rwanda and the determination of the Security Council not to give Romeo Dallaire the additional troops he required to prevent the genocide from taking place, despite the fact that the Security Council had incontrovertible evidence of what was coming. A very, very famous telegram that went out from Kigali, from General Dallaire in January the 11th, I think it was, 1994, and setting out what was in prospect, and the Security Council paid no attention because even the United States wanted to avoid engagement, wanted to avoid being governed by the Genocide Convention, which would have required countries to become engaged. So the Security Council was paralyzed in Rwanda. But it's also been paralyzed around Syria, Sudan, Darfur, Yemen, Myanmar, Venezuela, Zimbabwe. The hopes of the world resting on the assumption that when major powers gather together in the Security Council of the United Nations, somehow, out of the disputation and debates, there would be a consensus, there would be an agreement, there would be a way out of the morass of indecision. And it almost never happens because, of course, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have a veto. They have a vote which they can exercise. And we never seem to be able to get past the veto. And all of the discussions of reform of the Security Council have led nowhere, because the moment it is suggested that the Security Council be expanded, or that certain veto holders like France and the United Kingdom be to some extent dismantled, it never happens because someone has the right to exercise a veto. And there are a great many countries. I mean, there's Germany and Japan. There's Brazil and Argentina. There's India and Pakistan. There's Nigeria and South Africa. All of these countries playing major roles in their regional environments very much want to have a voice on the Security Council with the attendant veto which they could exercise if necessary, as the 5 powers have exercised them since 1945, and it is not possible to reform the Security Council. So one of the painful realities around the United Nations is that all of the politics of the UN are so dismal, and one constantly encounters this grating indecision which cannot be overcome. And so the public disaffection grows. I'm desperately worried about it, personally. I don't know what happens to multilateralism if on occasion you cannot provide the vehicle through which optimism and a solution emerges. And we've had time and time again where that option is foreclosed. And one of the disappointing realities, this just shows you that I have now reached a stage in life where I don't give a damn what people think of what I say and can say whatever I would wish. We're very disappointed in the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. Everybody thought that Guterres would emerge as a strong presence following Ban Ki-moon, who, in the nicest terms, was somewhat quiescent, passive, nondescript. But in the case of Antonio Guterres, you have a very, very intelligent fellow who was a leader of a country, who was head of the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, who has a great deal of capacity. There was a desperate wish the last time we elected a Secretary General, a couple of years ago, that we would have a woman, finally. But the world nations gathered together, decided that that was not acceptable, and the Security Council decided it wasn't acceptable, so they conferred the Secretary Generalship upon Antonio Guterres, who seems to be desperately cautious, will not take the kinds of principled and interventionist stands that were taken by Dag Hammarskjöld way back in the early days of the United Nations, and were taken more recently by Kofi Annan. And we wanted that kind of Secretary General at a time when the world is riven by ideological fratricide. And we didn't get it. And we're uncomfortable because of that. Many of you will not know that Article 99 of the Charter of the United Nations confers upon the Secretary General the right, some would say the obligation, to raise any matter which threatens international peace and security. And he can define peace and security as he would wish. And he can raise it and bring it to the Security Council, or he can initiate an investigation himself. He can make of an issue a cause célèbre if the world is not appropriately dealing with it. And one of the things most recently that was most disconcerting was the Khashoggi case in Saudi Arabia, because no one was prepared to launch a serious investigation of what happened, because Saudi Arabia was so determined to resist. And it would have been an immensely positive thing for the world if Antonio Guterres had said, look, the United Nations is going to launch an investigation. That's why we're here. The whole world seems to feel that what happened to Khashoggi was an absolute outrage. It was an absolute violation of every description of human rights, and it was a symptom of what's wrong in the region. So I, as Secretary General, I'm going to launch an investigation. I have the right under Article 99 to do so. There's nothing which causes me to draw back. And unfortunately, he never did. Now, Canada's role in all of this that's going on at the United Nations is really quite fascinating. Our public foreign policy decisions are largely driven by Canada's wish to be elected to the Security Council. I guess the elections come in 2020. And everything we do is premised on whether or not our positions will enhance our opportunity to be elected to the Security Council. It's quite fascinating. We have an excellent ambassador to the United Nations in New York, Marc-André Blanchard. And I mean, it's very difficult for me to say that because he was appointed by a Liberal, but then I was appointed by a Tory, so I have to hold back my natural proclivity to rhetorical excess, which you may have noticed. But Marc-André is a superb ambassador. He's extraordinarily bright, very articulate, has the capacity in both official languages, which I never had, and is much admired in the UN precincts and will drive things forward. There's no doubt in my mind that Canada will make it to the Security Council, but everything we do is, as I say, rooted in that objective. It is an obsession. Those obsessions are real. And so you have an interesting decision to have a Lima group to deal with Venezuela. I was saying to the Dean just a little while ago that there was an op-ed in the Globe and Mail today written by John Kirk and Stephen Kimber. I must say it was the most intelligent op-ed on Venezuela I have read anywhere over the last 2 or 3 weeks of the internal dissension and the public debate. They made the, I think, irrefutable point that you don't start engaging in driving a democracy in a country. You leave it up to the people of the country, and you certainly don't associate yourself with Trump's foreign policy, which is premised on wanting the oil of Venezuela. That's what this is all about. And the idea that we would be encouraging a military overthrow within Venezuela when we're not at all sure what the consequences might be in human terms if there was a civil conflict in that country, let at least the country, the citizens of the country, decide. And look at who we're engaged with. We're not only engaged with Donald Trump in this objection, but in this adventure, but we're also engaged with Brazil, which now has a president who has opened warfare on LGBT groups, on the disabled, on women. There's seldom been such a misogynist, and has actually engaged in assaults and extrajudicial executions. We're now working with Guatemala, God help us. We're now working with Honduras, again, which has a terribly right-wing nationalistic government, which is causing dreadful consequences for dissent within the country. We are now associating with groups of countries, or with countries in a group, where Canada has no position to do that. That doesn't fare well for Canadian public policy. And all of this is laid out in the op-ed by Kirk and Kimber much more eloquently, articulately, and coherently than I have just suggested it, but I urge you to take a look at that, because I have a feeling it will make people in Ottawa pause as the arguments are so intelligently traversed. And simply to create another group in the hope of soliciting support from Latin American countries and Central American countries come the time for the vote for the Security Council. None of this is mentioned, of course. That doesn't speak well of Canada. But it does speak to the inclination in United Nations multilateral and international circles that Canada is very much driven by the Security Council mandate. That's why there's going to be a huge conference on women in Vancouver in June of this year in order to demonstrate Canada's quote-unquote feminist credentials, which are not yet evident in foreign policy, by the way, well into the mandate of this government, but it's to show Canada's credentials to a number of delegates from countries and delegates of standing from countries from around the world. That's why our Prime Minister spoke almost exclusively of Indigenous rights when he addressed the General Assembly on the first occasion, because he wanted the world to see Canada as a harbinger of virtuous public policy. That's why we have troops in Mali now, even though it's of pretty short term and not really what the United Nations would have wished, but does say to the African continent, to some extent you can count on Canada. It's really, I was very lucky because I left the United Nations before Canada entered the Security Council. And I was part of the effort to have us elected, but never with quite the same determination as is the case today. So I must say that I hope we can overcome this proclivity to find supporters for our objective in the UN and take positions which are totally independent. For example, if you're talking about Latin America, Central America, that whole region, Canada could have made a tremendous contribution in the case of Haiti, but we didn't do so. And I'm talking about the earthquake that led to the cholera, 10,000 people dead, hundreds of thousands of people were infected. The peacekeeping mission from Nepal, which brought the cholera to Haiti, these were UN peacekeepers who brought the cholera to Haiti. And we never dealt with the cries of alarm and dismay that came from Haiti itself. And even though there were promises made that a great deal of money would be raised to assuage the agony which Haiti was experiencing, Canada made a very, very modest contribution, and our voice has since been stilled for reasons I don't understand, because of course we have very, very strong relationships with Haitians both in Canada and in Haiti itself. And now there is a discussion of peacekeeper babies, the babies who were left behind after the peacekeepers departed and are receiving no compensation from the UN, despite the fact that the UN made a promise to reimburse or compensate the mothers who were struggling desperately. And unfortunately, that has not happened, and I have not heard Canada speaking a word about it. After all, we had a Governor General whose background was in Haiti. We have a very, very strong relationship and huge Haitian community in Montreal. We could have said something and done something, and many groups pleaded with us to do so, and we never brought ourselves in line. And I must say that the greatest issue of all that now faces the world, I think, is climate change. And on climate change, not only is Canada following the path of the previous Conservative government and making no new estimable advances, but the Paris Accord and the recent conference in Poland were both bogus. And those who worry about global warming and understand it recognize that the document that emerged from the Paris talks was fundamentally flawed. Not only is it voluntary, but that even when you put together all of the targets which were indicated by the governments there assembled, even if you put it all together, it cannot possibly bring the global warming levels down to the 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees that they promised they would. And we're in a very, very critical situation. I don't know how to put it. I don't know. I can't find the words to demonstrate that the world is on the edge of an abyss. That the international climate change scientists in their most recent report said we have 12 years to turn everything around. And instead of turning things around, the discharge of carbon into the atmosphere is actually increasing. And in the United States in the last year it went up, and in Canada we've got a stability and an increase in certain provinces, and we are by no means attempting to meet the objectives which we indicated we would meet in Paris and again in Poland. And this is a United Nations conference. I mean, this is fundamentally the work of the United Nations. So secretaries general go to the UN Paris conference or the UN conference in Poland, and they make these gratuitous rhetorical speeches. And the substance of the speeches is pathetically inconsequential, because they know, as we know, that we're off the rails. How in heaven's name does one preserve the planet? I have 4 grandsons. I look at them, I love them, but I can't imagine what awaits them. It's unlikely that we will be able to turn things around before the end of this century. The musings about what is going to happen, the scientific musings about what is going to happen by 2050, suggests an apocalypse in the making. I live in a family where one of the members of our family, my daughter-in-law, Naomi Klein, has become one of the most articulate narrators of climate change there is in the world, and she's seen as such. And Naomi has always been optimistic, but I know that she's furiously struggling now with the sense that you cannot change things in the next decade, that there are too many countries on the loose, that every time you pick up the newspaper, there is another example of oil and gas and coal being refurbished in one country after another. How in God's name do we move to renewable energy when the discharge of carbon is contradicting everything that's required? I know that Naomi and Avi and a lot of people on the Democratic left are feeling better because of the New Deal Green Plan, which is emerging from the left wing of the Democratic Party in the United States. And they feel when they look at that plan that there is some hope. But we have to move with an almost supernatural rapidity to achieve the targets. And I don't see the United Nations coming together on it. And what is so perplexing, what drives me crazy, is that even if the countries are recalcitrant, negligent, begrudging, refusing to move, there is an international secretariat. There is a secretary general, and there are a lot of people around him with portfolios about which they could pronounce. And if there were a series of voices that spoke to the issue of climate change, that spoke to the issue of global warming, that held press conference after press conference, alerting the world to what is happening, then conceivably there would be sufficient citizen pressure that governments would begin to move. But instead, there is, relatively speaking, silence about the issue that imperils the entire planet. And that issue was predominant until about a week ago, when the United States announced that it was categorically pulling out of the Medium-Range Arms Treaty. And Putin immediately announced that they were going to build new atomic and nuclear weapons in that range. And we are very close to being thrown back to another Cold War period of weapon building and weapon accumulation. And again, if there isn't an international multilateral organization with the courage and the principle uncompromising, to say, how can you be so trifling around several billion people? What in God's name is wrong with you? Do you not see what is happening? And I suspect, I was thinking of the Pugwash group here in Nova Scotia earlier today, I've been thinking that our focus is soon going to shift to encompass the possibility of another Cold War arms race, as well as the reality of a climate change. Where, for example, is our ambassador for disarmament? By the way, just as an addendum, where is the American ambassador to the United Nations? There hasn't been one since Nikki Haley left, and although there is somebody who has been quietly nominated, she has disappeared into the shadows, and you don't even have the kind of voice from the world's superpower at the United Nations which would give us some sense of engagement and involvement. But that's all, and I won't be this long and this discombobulated for the rest of my remarks. That's all the political side of the United Nations, which focuses on the Security Council and the General Assembly and the Secretary General. And then there's the whole other half of the United Nations, which people sometimes forget about. And that's the funds and the programs and the agencies. That's UNICEF and UNFPA, the Fund for Population Activities, and UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, and WFP, the World Food Program, and the World Health Organization, and the International Labor Organization, this whole panoply of agencies that does magnificent work on the ground. And if and when you're traveling through developing countries, as I did constantly when been given the privilege of working on HIV for the UN, that's all they talk about. They're not interested in what goes on at the Security Council, even though that may imperil the world. What they're interested in is what the agencies are doing on the ground to help their people and to work in concert with community-based organizations in those countries. For them, UNICEF is the United Nations. For them, the World Food Program in the midst of conflict is the United Nations. For them, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees dealing with this massive refugee and migration crisis, that's the United Nations. They don't think of the political paralysis in the Security Council. And I have to say that these funds and programs do magnificent work, and they uphold the conventions which countries so often ignore. So UNICEF upholds the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and UN Women deals with the Convention on Women. And if you're dealing with lectures from Shaar Shalom on tolerance and diversity and inclusion, those are the things which are manifest in the conventions of the United Nations. Those are the things that speak to human rights. That's why at 2:30 in the morning on December the 10th, I guess 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt put down her pen after endless negotiation on a convention to enshrine and install human rights, and said, the long, hard job done. But in fact, the long, hard job was just beginning. And the human rights component of the UN is in grave danger because of the rise of nationalistic and xenophobic sentiments in one country after another around the world. And these agencies, they care, and they care deeply. And the one area of Achilles' heel, which has recently emerged and is most worrying, is the way in which the United Nations refuses to pay any attention to the entire Me Too movement. It is as though the United Nations, because there is no accountability, if you ask a question of the Secretary General or the Secretariat of the United Nations, they don't even have to answer you. If you ask for material and statistical data, they give you only what they want to give you, and usually virtually nothing at all. It's really fascinating how reports are not released, and there's no Freedom of Information Act at the United Nations. It doesn't exist. So to get the information and the data we need to make the policy pronouncement that we would wish to make, it all has to be done independently through NGOs and through many of the agencies. But most recently, and I say this with some pride because the organization which the Dean mentioned, AIDS Free World, has been at the heart of this discussion, and my co-director has led it. It's a matter of driving the UN to understand that sexual misconduct in peacekeeping operations and in the agencies themselves, just as it has been revealed that Oxfam and Save the Children, and I saw today a story on Amnesty International, which frankly astounded me, but there's obvious problems at the grassroots in agencies' offices all over the world in the whole development arena, and the United Nations pays almost no attention. Most recently, the executive director of UNAIDS, an organization close to my heart, the executive director of UNAIDS was forced to leave his office 6 months before the end of his term because of his efforts to evade responsibility for the sexual misconduct of his immediate deputy. And there was, as is so often the case, an expert panel convened in significant measure at our prodding, and it released a report which was the single most devastating indictment of internal United Nations practices I have ever read. It is extraordinary. It was chaired by a woman in Australia who was head of the Human Rights Commission in Australia, and there were 3 other commissioners, and they produced a report about the incorrigible bullying, patriarchy, sexual misconduct, impossible practices in the workplace that harassed that one small agency over the last 5 years. And yet, there's a whole panoply of agencies which have yet to be discussed and have yet to be assessed. And so the UN, because Antonio Guterres makes the appointments, he appoints these people, he can remove these people, but there wasn't a single word said, not a word. And I have to say to you, it's very distressing. So can the United Nations be saved? Well, you know, what we lack in this world, I think, is leadership. I hope you agree with me somewhat. In the United States, I think one can make a reasonably cogent argument that the leadership is flawed. I think one could say that since Brexit, the same is true for the United Kingdom. I think one could say that since the Yellow Jackets in France, the same is true of Macron. I would challenge most people in this audience to tell me who the Prime Minister of Italy is, because Italy politically is in great difficulty. We cannot put everything, I guess, on Angela Merkel. Even she is now somewhat compromised in the politics of Germany. Putin obviously isn't someone on whom one would wish to rest the case, and China is moving as a superpower in such independent fashion, so determined to make its place in the world, regardless of what the world may think, that you couldn't rely on China. So where is the leadership? Where is the principled leadership? Barack Obama was a principled leader. And Gordon Brown of the United Kingdom was one of the few leaders who talked of poverty and inequality, talked of those dual elements which so harass most of the developing world, and yet all of the official development assistance, which could make a significant difference to those countries, is slowly atrophying and being drawn back. Boy, that's painful. I know there are a lot of grandmothers in this audience who support my foundation, and I love them for it. But I think it's important for all of us to know that all of those projects are being threatened by the gradual cutbacks of the donor world, which are needed, the funding which is needed to keep people alive. We need leaders who will identify these realities, who will speak of them cogently and with feeling, who have an empathy and compassion for what is happening in the world that resonates in every word they say. We need leaders who are not afraid to take on issues that are disputatious and where there will be disagreement, but where principle will ultimately prevail because they gather around them a sonorous voice of agreement. It's so desperately required. We do have in Canada a Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who has often spoken of analogous issues, but there doesn't seem to be the kind of gravitas, there doesn't seem to be the kind of intellectual weight behind his pronouncements which bring other countries into the fold. I'm not a pessimist about things. I worry about the direction of the world. I worry about the damage that's being done. I cannot stand the images of the children of the Rohingya, or in Yemen, or in the Central African Republic, or in South Sudan, or in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or what's now going on in the streets of Harare in Zimbabwe. I just can't stand the violation of the human condition. You know, back in 2005, I think I'm right that was the year, the world agreed to a principle called responsibility to protect. The Dean mentioned it in some notes that I received about things I might talk about. And responsibility to protect is essentially the principle that says that when a nation violates the human rights of its own citizenry in a way that is unconscionable, then the world has a responsibility to protect. That the idea of sovereignty cannot prevail when you are defaming and annihilating your own citizens. So the world can use political judgment, diplomatic judgment, economic sanctions as a last recourse, the possibility of military intervention, but that the world should make a tremendous effort to protect the citizens who are under siege from their own government. And it's not happening. It's not happening in those countries where it's most desperately needed. So you go through this fabricated apparatus again. You agree to a principle unanimously, all the countries of the world, and then you pay it no heed whatsoever. It's kind of like global warming. You agree to a principle, and then you disregard it at home. It's kind of like the convention or the declaration that was just signed on migration and refugees. You make a noise about a desperate human predicament, and you go back home. And what you've signed amounts to very little. There have to be voices of leadership which challenge these things frontally. You know why I love Romeo Dallaire? I love Romeo because he speaks from the heart every time he gives a speech, because there is resonating from him the sense that if he had the opportunity to change the world, he would. And that's what's needed. People who in a principled, compassionate way want to change the world and save the United Nations in the process. And at the moment, we don't have it. Thank you. Thank you. I got a big kick last night out of watching the women congressional representatives dressed in white as they stood at various moments during that lunatic exegesis and made their presence known. I got a real kick out of that. I also got a kick out of the fact that Donald Trump attacked socialism. That made me feel better about my ideology than I felt in many a year. He wouldn't know the difference between Venezuela socialism and Danish socialism. I mean, because it requires thought. But it was nice to see that it was interesting to see that he's going to make it an idée fixe, that he's going to use it in the next campaign as a way of demonizing the Democrats and calling them socialists. My goodness, it's fun to live just long enough to see that the world can sink into lunacy with affection. Yes. Are there questions? I gather there are questions. I think the dean can transport. Who was?
I'll let you control the questions.
Okay.
Keep your questions very brief. I suspect we're going to have a long lineup of people who want to do it. Keep the questions very brief. If you can keep your questions very brief, I suspect there will be a long lineup of people who would like to ask questions. We have 2 mics.
Oh, I see.
On each end, and I guess we can rotate back and forth. Why don't we start with this individual?
Please, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I have a question that relates to your title. If the United Nations cannot be saved, what optimistic,
What would we do without it?
what will replace it?
Well, that's the logical and perfectly reasonable question. It was the same question they asked after the League of Nations, and along came the United Nations. I can't answer that question. It's the right question, and I don't know the answer. I think we have a greater opportunity to make the United Nations work more effectively with the right leadership. And I guess leadership is a rotational thing. You know, I think that the United States might have a new leader after 2020. And if that's the case, perhaps public policy will change in a way which will be beneficial to the world. And I think the same thing may happen in the United Kingdom as soon as the next election occurs. So I hold my breath waiting for the change of political leadership that can bring sanity to the UN and take principled positions where they are not now being taken, rather than feeling we've got to get rid of the UN and try something else because we'll never get to something else. At least we have a charter, which, by the way, is a magnificent document. We have a whole range of conventions on economic and social rights, on political and civil rights, on children, on women, on race, on disability. I mean, we have a wonderful set of conventions which, with the right leadership, could be given implementation. So that's why I'm not immediately pessimistic. There is a ballot box. People in many countries can still vote, and political change can occur, and with it, societal change. Yes?
Yes, I'm wondering how you think the United Nations can work in a world where 26 individuals have more wealth than the bottom half of the population.
Yes, I don't, maybe it's just me. Did people hear that, that question? It's the most recent Oxfam report, which was tabled at the World Economic Forum last month in Davos. It's always ironic that the people who have created the mess we're in all get together to congratulate each other about the mess they've created and how wonderful it is for the world. And then along comes Oxfam with its annual report on poverty and inequality, and made the point in this report that 26 individuals have as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. That is to say, 26 individuals have as much accumulative wealth as 3.8 billion people. And they then go through a fascinating narrative breaking down the various components of the numbers of billionaires and the average increase they've received over the last year compared to the mass of the world's humankind who have lost income or have gone down in value or have remained static and stagnant. Oxfam does a lovely job with that report. And what you're saying, and again, this is embarrassing, I can't really answer because I think the ravages of inequality are what will ultimately drive the most dramatic social change. That you simply cannot erect inequality of such a gross kind in countries and within and between countries and within countries without having some kind of convulsion. And I'm hoping that convulsion will not end up in lodging a bunch of right-wing nationalistic governments. I hope it will be more progressive than that, but who knows? But but the idea of inequality is exactly the right idea to raise. I don't think there's anyone at that microphone. Because it's on my left, I feel very sad. Why don't I go to this gentleman? Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't.
Thank you very much. Thank you
yeah.
very much for your erudite remarks, if somewhat dispiriting. My name is Leah Sarson. I'm an assistant professor of international relations here at Dal. And I teach, among the things that I teach is a course on introductory human rights. One of the framing devices that I use in my classroom is a comment by Professor John Holmes, who said that in order to make sound foreign policy, one must accept the paradox of foreign policy. And I think nowhere is that more true than when we talk about the international human rights regime. And yet in my classroom, my students and myself, we struggle with the many contradictions of the politics of human rights versus the theories of human rights. And I ask you, as someone who has just spent the last few years in the classroom, if perhaps you might be able to offer some insights to reconcile those contradictions, those inconsistencies between the way we think about human rights and the way we see human rights in action.
One of the no, you're right to applaud because it is the right question. One of the things which is so galling is to have a situation where Yemen is elected as a vice president of UN Women, when Yemen stands 139th in the 139 countries on the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report. And it's more than you can cope with when Saudi Arabia becomes president of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, given their record on human rights, as they have become, again, for another 3-year term, a member of the executive board of UN Women. So you have these direct contradictions where countries which are most graphically engaged in violations of human rights end up calling the shot around conventions or submissions which are made. Again, I think that what's required is leadership which says we won't submit to this without a fight. We won't submit to violations of human rights which are palpable and significant without drawing attention to them. Now there's something, can I say something very sort of personal? I was very lucky as an ambassador, probably luckier than almost any other Canadian ambassador for a long time, because Brian Mulroney allowed me, provided I didn't lose my mind, allowed me to take positions and speak to positions which weren't normally taken by diplomats. Diplomats are supposed to be insufferably cautious, and I was insufferably out of control. And he was extraordinarily kind and encouraging about it. And what it taught me was that it's not the end of the world to take a strong stand on something, even if you know it's going to offend some of your fellow countries or colleague countries. And that's what's missing. The gap between the contradictions in human rights where you have these wonderful conventions and then atrocities on the ground. How do you reconcile the two? Well, you can never reconcile atrocity, but you can point out that it's happening by taking positions in international forums which countries normally refuse to take. They just refuse to take it. And that's an appalling truth about internationalism. Everybody bites their tongue. I mean, I'm sure that countries that care about human rights who are on the executive board of UN Women, thought to themselves, oh my God, how can this be happening? But Norway, Sweden, the United Kingdom, United States, Australia, Switzerland, all on the board, all of them with reasonable human rights components, not a word. Why not a word? Because it's considered indelicate and incorrect to criticize a colleague country. So if you want to bridge that gap, you've got to talk to the gap in the forums where people will be forced to listen, and we don't do that.
Thank you very much.
That's what I tell my students for what it's worth.
Thank you.
Yes, anybody? Oh, good. Sure. I'm much relieved.
You've spoken a couple of times tonight about how strong political leadership is needed, something different than what we've had before. So what advice would you have for both the young people to become that type of leader and to the political parties to change and welcome them?
Well, actually, I've taught at McMaster, McGill, and Ryerson. And my experience, and I don't have credentials as a professor, but my experience with the students has been exhilarating because I see in front of me young people in their very, very late teens or early 20s who are agog with possibility. And they just want to get out there and change the world. It's amazing. And I can recall a seminar class I had at McGill. The students, there was only 25 of them. The students are all over the world, from Argentina to Burkina Faso. I get notes from them about what they're doing. And it's exhilarating because I see a generational change, which if it could pick up momentum, could mean an ultimate change in the leadership that I've been talking about, that I think all of us would wish to embrace. And, you know, you pick the political party of your choice. If you want, I can make a suggestion. But you pick the political party of your choice, and you try to reform their inner workings if you find it repugnant in some way. I think a lot can be done by the movement of this new generation, which is emerging. I used to think it was merely rhetorical falderall, you know, the usual rubbish that we disgorge to make ourselves feel better. Oh, we'll leave behind us a stronger cadre than we ourselves inherited. But in truth, it's very impressive, the younger people that are moving now, to see them all over the world changing things. Oh my God, it's just fascinating. And of course, the internet and social media has meant a capacity to engage that we never had, or I never had. I mean, that's so long ago where I was concerned. I'm still looking at Gestetner machines and typewriters. And I was saying to the dean that if I want to get an upgrade on Air Canada, I go to a counter where the official behind the counter is over 60. And they think, Stephen Lewis. Stephen, I know that name. That was and I told the dean that in fact, one person said to me, and I couldn't falter for it, I just had to laugh. She said, "Oh, you're still alive." And of course, it's quite valid. I'm pleased, but nonetheless, it was an interesting turn. Yes.
Yes. So, if Canada achieves our goal of joining the Security Council, what can we do with that power to make all these sacrifices you've talked about worthwhile?
No, an excellent point. And in fact, when you enter the Security Council as a non-permanent member, there are 5 permanent members: Russia, China, the U.S., France, and the United Kingdom. It's an immediate post-war assemblage. 75 years old. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense in the common day world. But I think that when you're a non-permanent member, you are entitled to raise these issues. Again, because of the sense of suffocating propriety which afflicts the Security Council, the non-permanent members are reluctant to raise things that will win the antagonism of one of the permanent members. So people bite their tongues. But in truth, if you wanted to, and on occasion this has happened, you can raise any issue you wish and have it picked up and debated, and it may be discarded. They may veto it. They may refuse to vote on it, but it brings it into the public arena, and that's really important, and you can make some good points. Yes?
First of all, thank you for being here. I took a trip with my family to the United Nations building a couple summers ago and was very impressed by the building and the displays that were around. And I toured a show in Nova Scotia about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the UN Declaration. And so we toured elementary and junior high schools to educate about the documents. I was distressed to go to the gift area. And after, being illuminated by all the displays and going to see the chambers and such, I was distressed to see chocolate bars being sold there that were not fair trade, and chocolate that was being sold there that was not fair trade. I was distressed to see shirts being sold there that had been made in Honduras. It was a huge disconnect, and so we were very excited to go to this place that we had been reading about and thinking about for a very long time, and espousing the values of the declarations, the conventions, to a variety of youth, and was very disappointed. And that's when my journey started, about thinking, oh, there's a huge disconnect. So when you talk about the Security Council and the work that's being done on the ground being different, I can definitely see that. My question for you, and maybe this is a question for all of us, is why were you never Prime Minister of Canada?
I missed that. Oh. Well, if I'm honest to you, it didn't pay well enough. It's very nice of you to allow those words to cross your lips, but it would have been a disaster for Canada. So I've always recognized that although I think that the government of British Columbia is turning out to be a pretty terrific NDP government, and I was always aware in Ontario that I just didn't know enough, just too hard to grasp everything, to be catapulted into the seats of power. There's a certain niceness, solidarity about being an opposition party, where you can speak your mind more fully than governments seem to be able to do. I can't get over the way in which governments prevaricate and reformulate and pretend and don't answer and take you off the question. I've never understood why they do that, why it's not possible to be straightforward and engage in candor on occasion. But I guess those times will come. I sat in the Ontario legislature so many years ago, I can barely credit it. I sat in the Ontario legislature in the 1960s and 1970s for more than 15 years when Bill Davis was the Premier of Ontario. And he was a remarkably decent and honorable man. And we would have almost fratricidal debates across the floor of the legislature because we had profoundly different ideologies, but we respected each other and liked each other and became friends then, and we are friends today. It's just so interesting. Those were the conservatives of yesteryear. Those were the conservatives who valued human decency and appropriate policy. And so that if you had disagreements, it didn't end up in a brutal, unpleasant calling of names. You disagreed vehemently, but it was on issues. It was never personal. It was never vituperative. It's so different from what I see today. I can't get over it. So I consider myself very lucky to have been part of a political genre which was respectful. It was really respectful. Bill Davis, bless him, has come with me to raise money for my foundation. A conservative Premier of Ontario, and I was leader of the opposition, and we fought over things daily. Roy McMurtry, who was the Attorney General in Ontario, sat on the board of my foundation for several years. You can build decent friendships while having profound philosophic disputes. And I'm so sorry that politics has ground down into this abattoir of acrimony. I don't get it. I don't understand it, and I think that it does terrible damage to public discourse. All of which is to say, it's a damn good thing I was never Prime Minister. Yes.
Hi, my name's Cece Haberfellner. I'm a second-year poli-sci and international development student here at Dal. And my question is, what do you consider success at the UN? Because even in circumstances where we've had strong leadership, where say in like 1948 when Raphael Lemkin got the UN Convention on the Prevention of Genocide passed, it was supposed to be much bigger and he had to grind it down just for it to pass. Or you look at something like the International Criminal Tribunal in the Yugoslavia, where even though that's got a lot of leadership behind it, it still hasn't actually convicted that many people of genocide. And so even in cases where you do have strong leadership, you don't always see a lot of impact. So even in the ideal case, how do you justify, or not justify, how do you measure success in the UN, because you're never going to get that ideal form?
Well, I think you measure success when a very complex and difficult problem is somehow resolved. And that happens very rarely. When it does happen, you see it as a success. It's very difficult now. It's interesting you mentioned the tribunal in Yugoslavia, and of course there's the tribunal in Rwanda, but there's also the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court is now under attack by many countries in Africa, which say to the International Criminal Court, the only people you have indicted for genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity are African leaders. How come? Why has the International Criminal Court suddenly become an arm of a neo-imperial instinct? And it has done great damage to the court, and now you have a president of the United States who said he wants nothing to do with the court. So you add to that pressure on the court. I fear for the court. The court has been really important to set out the bounds of behavior. But, you know, I sympathize with those people who say, how come the court never indicted Tony Blair? How come it never indicted George Bush? What was done in Iraq was unquestionably crimes against humanity. How come you only go after al-Bashir, or you only go after certain African oligarchs? Very easy to indict them. They've actually committed the acts themselves. But what about those who are behind the commission of the acts? I sense the deep misgivings of so many of my African friends about the court. And I think you judge success by having occasional progress. For example, in the International Criminal Court on Rwanda, when it was decided to include rape as a crime against humanity, that was an extremely important piece of progress, because it then entered the lexicon of all subsequent discussions. And today in Zimbabwe, when Mnangagwa turns out to be no better than Mugabe, and there's evidence of rape of the women by the security forces, it's so interesting that most of the stories which are appearing are focusing on rape as the cardinal sin of violence, because it has been given the imprimatur of legitimacy by the International Criminal Court. So I look for those points of progress, but you're right, they're rare, and you have to look pretty hard sometimes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm being told that I can take 2 more questions. Well, I'm frail enough that I'll settle for 2. Yes, sir.
All right. My name is Ifo. I am Isoko from the Niger Delta region.
From where?
The Niger Delta region. The British visitors didn't ask us what our land was and decided to give it a name, like they do it in Canada. So I am liking most of what you said, except for your comment about Romeo Dallaire. I think from an African perspective, there is a serious potential case to be held against him for his contributions to the genocide, but that's a different story for a different day. The question I will have to ask is about this myth, the myth of the nation state, which is a capitalist creation, which was created for genocide, created for theft, and created for the enslavement of Africans. And this is African Heritage Month. So we're asking, or you were asking, about why is Canada not doing anything? It's like a pretense that this is actually a state that actually has anything that is worth respecting. The fact that this country is so rich, and yet there's so many indigenous peoples who do not have clean water. This is a country that managed to go to Afghanistan in the middle of a war zone and made sure that there was water for the soldiers. So there's absolutely no excuse for Canada's lack of anything meaningful when it comes to Indigenous peoples. So you talked about the right to protect. So by that rule, shouldn't Canada be charged with its failure to deal with Indigenous peoples, with its failure to deal with the killing of Africans in this country, with what it's doing in Mali right now where they're hunting down people like me? So what I'm wondering is, as you talk about telling the truth in uncomfortable places, when we actually tell the truth about what the Western world, not just what they did in the past, which was horrible, but what it's doing today. Because if we actually want to change it, we have to admit that there is absolutely no honor in the so-called crown. This crown is built on blood. The League of Nations was a bunch of criminals, genocidal criminals, who decided to form another organization called the UN. So the question, I guess, since we're also talking about the TRC, is when will we start having conversations about the rights of Indigenous peoples, respecting that right because we're an unceded territory, and instead of asking for United Nations, how about we start respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples all over the globe, the right to self-determination, which nations like Canada are still refusing to do?
I can't take issue with a lot of what you're saying. Those sovereign states, so-called, are in many times they're artificial creations, and they were created for the benefit of the Western colonialists. And if you're from the Niger Delta, then you know, to force on Nigeria the Hausa and the Yoruba and the Igbo was a British conception, and they didn't give a damn about the people who would be affected by the creation of a federal state, which was difficult to engage, was difficult to democratize. So you make very good points. I think we have to respect the fact, as much as I regret it, that overcoming sovereignty is one of the most difficult things to do in the world. There's just no question about it. States have been created, artificial or otherwise, and they will not give up their sovereign status. So if you want to engage in multilateral progress, if you want to improve things and get states to concede some of their status, it's terribly, terribly difficult.
So you can start in Canada by actually respecting the Indigenous
Well,
people's
Canada,
lands.
you know, Canada can espouse those ideals, but it doesn't mean that it's easily accepted. It's just very tough. But we're in a tremendously privileged position in this country, tremendously privileged. And I think everybody here recognizes that. We have pockets of desperate poverty and oppression. So much of what has been done to Indigenous communities in Canada reflects the reality of oppression. But on the other hand, we have a country which is flourishing and has a voice, and it would be lovely if it were used more vigorously. One last question, if I may. Sorry, I'm having difficulty seeing and hearing, but go ahead.
Hello. It's my pleasure to listen to your speech tonight. I'm from China, and my question will be, what do you think about the Huawei case and the human rights case Meng Zhou? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I did not hear it. Oh, the Huawei case and China. Oh, my God. I have a plane to catch early in the morning. I have to leave the hotel at 6:30, but it's all right to leave. People have walked out on me often, and when you come back, I'll still be speaking. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think that in the case of dealing with China, Canada's doing a pretty good job. I wish that this wasn't all hooked into the United States. I wish that we didn't have to deal with the reasons for making the arrest and going to court and the extradition proceedings. I really think this is so obvious that I'm almost ashamed to say it. There has to be a complete reassessment of our relations with China based on something more than trade, because we're going to constantly be caught in the dilemma of human rights on the one hand and trade on the other, and this huge growing behemoth of power and wealth. You should see what's happening in the continent of Africa. All the roads, the schools, the hospitals, the bridges, the environmental areas, they're being funded by China. They are in country after country. They are so present in some of those countries that you would think that they were the government. It's just extraordinary, their intrusion on that continent, which they see as a tremendous resource of the future, which it probably is. Africa will probably have 1 billion people by 2050, and that's an incredible market to think about. So the extraordinary apparatus of China is something that we just have to sit down and work through and not work impulsively. That's a mistake. I don't know what could have been done. I like the idea that we're standing up for the rule of law and that we have an extradition treaty and that that's what we were required to do. And in many countries that would suffice. It obviously is a raw wound for China's view of that aspect of justice. I don't suggest that we should pull back from it. I think we made the right decision, but we haven't thought through as a consequence of what happens to the 2 men who are now in prison, what happens to the man whose sentence was increased to a death sentence. What is it about China that allows it to run roughshod over the rest of the world? Is it simply the exercise of power and wealth, or is there something else at work? Are there mechanisms which we can put our finger on and find a way to work with? You just have to do something about it because it has now become one of the most intolerable and difficult features of the planet. And Huawei and what has happened in Canada is but a mere minor manifestation. Thank you for asking the question. Sorry for the inadequate answer. And I just want to say to everybody here how much I appreciate your being here. And I've enjoyed it immensely.
My name is Joanna Mirsky-Wexler, and I'm joining you this evening from the Shaar Shalom congregation. Mr. Lewis, on behalf of our synagogue, from Dalhousie's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and from everyone in the audience tonight, I want to thank you for your insightful and incisive words. What an impact you've made upon our country and across the globe. So really, thank you for giving us all so very much to contemplate tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joanna. By the way, I want to thank Joanna and Seth Bloom, who's here tonight. I've worked with Seth for 2 years on developing the Shaar Shalom Lecture. It's been a real pleasure working with the Synagogue again this year to bring Stephen. So I want to thank you for that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen. I teach world politics. I teach international relations, conflict, crisis, war, genocide. I deal with cases related to the failure of the UN, Rwanda, Darfur, Bosnia, Kosovo. And I'm pegged as a realist by my students. And my students often come to me and say, my God, those lectures are so depressing. Yours was a brilliantly insightful lecture. But my God, you depressed the hell out of even me. And I want to thank you for that. And what's inspiring about that lecture is that there is some optimism embedded in the fact that Canada does have opinion leaders like you shaping opinions for the good and pushing back against power. And I want to thank you for that. I just really want to take 2 seconds to thank Emily Snooks, who has done such an outstanding job helping me through the logistics of an event like this. This takes about 6 to 8 months in planning, and she has been instrumental in helping us produce an event like this. I want to thank Genevieve McIntyre, our faculty's alumni and communications officer, for all of your help. When we announced this lecture, within about an hour, the room that we originally booked was overwhelmed by the outpouring of love for this man to show up to that lecture. We had to change the lecture to this event. This is sold out and standing room. So that says a lot, Stephen, about your contributions. And I also want to thank Sheila Blair Reed, the Associate VP Alumni and External, and her entire staff and team who helped with the event tonight. Thank you all for coming. Stay tuned for other events by our faculty. Drive safely. Thanks for coming.